Cuba is currently undergoing one of the fastest solar revolutions in the world. However, unlike some other countries embracing renewables, this is less because Cuba is worried about climate change, and more because Cuba simply doesn't have a choice. The island nation in the Caribbean, which is heavily reliant on energy imports, has been suffering its worst rolling blackouts in decades because of a US oil blockade imposed in February. And, well, like other oil-dependent countries who have been recently reminded of the dangers of relying too much on fossil fuel imports, they've turned to the renewables giant, China. So in this video, we're going to take a closer look at the impacts of the US blockade on Cuba and how China has played a big role in helping to mitigate its effects recently. Trump has always loved criticizing China, but between his first and second presidency, we'd argue that he's lost his advantage. Well, you can read how we think Beijing turned the tables on Trump in the latest issue of our magazine, Too Long. That's just one of the articles in our longest issue ever. Subscribe to get your copy by clicking the link in the description. Let's start with some quick context on Cuba's economic and energy situation, because it's been quite bleak for some time. The US has been choking the country's economy in various ways since the 60s because of the island's embrace of communism. Back then, Cuba had the Soviet Union to rely on, especially for oil. But after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, Cuba had lost its main lifeline and oil supplier, which is not a great thing for a country whose largest source of energy is oil. So the 90s were pretty bad for Cuba. But things started to turn around in 1998, when Hugo Chavez became president of Venezuela, and within a year made a deal with Cuba's president, Fidel Castro, to become the island's main oil provider. Venezuela remained the largest exporter of oil to Cuba for well over 2 decades. This changed in January 2026, however, when the US forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in Caracas. Since then, Trump has waged an intense campaign of economic warfare against Cuba in the hopes of pushing the communist regime to the brink. In February, Trump announced an oil blockade on Cuba, which forced countries that could potentially serve as alternative suppliers of oil to stop exporting or risk tariffs from Washington. Mexico, for example, which had become a key fuel supplier to Cuba after the US halted oil shipments from Venezuela, completely suspended its exports after Trump's tariff threats. As a result, Cuba has suffered through its worst ever energy crisis, with nationwide blackouts, persistent shortages, and major economic distress generally. To mitigate against this crisis, Cuba has been turning to renewable energy, although we should say this isn't an entirely new phenomenon. Havana started installing solar panels in rural health centers in the late 1980s and opened its first wind farm in 1999. But since 2024, the country has been taking it to a much larger scale. In just the past 2 years, at least 41 mid-size and 18 smaller-scale solar parks have been built, according to the Wall Street Journal. Cuba is now planning to build 92 mid-sized parks by 2028, projected to bring a total of 2 gigawatts of solar power online, which could be enough to power more than 1.5 million homes. And, well, it's hard nowadays to embrace solar en masse without the help of China, which manufactures about 80% of the world's solar panels. According to customs data, China sent Cuba $117 million worth of equipment in 2025, up from $3 million in 2023. Beijing has also increased its support by donating thousands of photovoltaic systems for isolated communities and equipment to boost solar power generation. Now, to be clear, China isn't just doing this out of the goodness of its heart. The Caribbean, where Cuba is located, is one of Beijing's main transit zones for raw materials from Latin America. Cuba also possesses some of the world's largest nickel and cobalt reserves, which are key minerals for electric vehicle batteries, renewable energy technologies, and advanced electronics, and help to cement China's dominance in the sector. In fact, over the past 2 decades, China has replaced the US as the dominant trading partner for most countries in Latin America. Anyway, nonetheless, it's probably true to say that Chinese solar power has provided an economic lifeline to Cuba during perhaps its most acute energy crisis in recent history. But there are limitations on what solar and China can do. First off, solar energy still accounts for only about 10% of Cuba's electricity generation, and as we know, solar plants can only supply electricity during daylight hours. This is where battery storage typically comes in handy, but it remains the most expensive component of any solar energy system, and one that Cuba doesn't have in spades. Cuba's energy minister admitted in April, for instance, that the country is only using a fraction of the solar capacity it has deployed because it lacks enough battery storage to manage the fluctuations that naturally come with solar power. This is one of the reasons why, according to analysis by Cashman, increasing solar's share of total generation will become more expensive with time. Second, the island's energy infrastructure is in very poor shape. Its own Soviet-era fossil fuel power plants have deteriorated so much that output has dropped substantially. The same is true of the country's power lines, which lose a big chunk of electricity during transmission. And, well, the country's grid is also increasingly fragile. Any shock usually results in massive outages. So essentially, in order for the country to properly transform its energy infrastructure, it would need a significant amount of money, which it can't realistically get at the required scale or speed, given the country's prolonged economic crisis. To give you a sense of how acute the current crisis is, in April, the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean predicted that Cuba's GDP would shrink by 6.5% in 2026. To be clear, Cuba's economic woes are nothing new. The country never fully recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic, which badly hurt its tourism sector. On top of that, the country's fuel shortages over the years and systemic blackouts have caused major airlines to slash flight frequencies, causing bookings to drop. Add to that the collapse of trade and the destruction of the island's sugar industry, and the outlook is pretty grim. All this to say that Cuba is going through a crisis that Chinese solar panels alone cannot solve. But for a country facing a humanitarian crisis caused largely by US sanctions, they do represent a lifeline. And for China, it's another way of showing the world its model of engagement compared to that of the US's. One comes across as a more reliable partner looking to increase trade ties, while the other is the reason the lights are off. And for a country that has spent more than 60 years under a US embargo, the contrast is huge. Now, with a story like this, it takes us a lot of time and research to make sure that we're getting all of the correct and up-to-date information. But in today's world, it feels like 99% of websites demand your email address just to simply visit the page to learn more. Normally, we'd just be tempted to put our email in just to get the information quicker. But now we know better than that, and that's because of Proton Mail. Say we had put our email in, where does it actually go? Chances are our information will now be sold online to anyone who wants it, and our email inboxes are suddenly cluttered with a bunch of spam we definitely never asked for. Thankfully, Proton Mail offers a wide range of features to keep you safe and stop this from happening. From preventing dangerous phishing attacks with their PhishGuard protection feature, to protecting your identity by alerting you if your email has been sold on the dark web, Proton Mail has it all. They even offer unlimited email aliases to help you get around those pesky websites that demand your information. That means no ads, no tracking, and no profiling, which feels harder than ever to avoid today. Making the switch doesn't have to be hard, as Proton Mail's Easy Switch tool lets you move your emails and contacts from your current provider within just a few steps. You can even connect your Gmail account and receive and send messages from it directly in Proton Mail, while you transfer everything over at your own pace. And if migrating all of your emails sounds a bit overwhelming right now, you can easily create an account today and just use both. One for those spam emails and one for the important emails you actually need to see. So start using Proton Mail for free using our link proton.me/TLDR, and you'll be one step closer to a fully protected online experience free from data exploitation.